slightly inappropriate for me to talk too much about the Baker Group, but I'll talk about it a fair amount, and how it is going to affect or not affect both Syria and Iran. I think Jeffrey's description of the Baker Group as being contentious is to say understated. I'm very skeptical that it is going to produce anything that is going to cause a significant change in American foreign policy. Up until very recently, I think there has been a certain insouciance, actually, about the difficulties in Iraq. That has now changed. I think there's a much more serious discussion about Iraq, and I think as people start to contemplate the possibilities that would entail and would come about with an American withdrawal, or just a reduction in the number of soldiers, and you begin to think about that actually in very detailed ways, that you walk away from that thinking that any reduction is probably going to cause a collapse of the Iraqi government. There's some disagreement on those issues, I think, within the group, but certainly there is a growing impression and realization that, one, the United States really can't reduce that much. If you just look at how troops are deployed in Iraq, that my colleague at AEI, Fred Kagan, is going to have a piece out in the Weekly Standard in a week's time. I think it's the most insightful piece yet written on the numbers game in Iraq, and when you look at it, you realize quite quickly, and Fred's a military historian, he's first rate, that the Americans really can't reduce much beyond 80,000 troops, and if you go down to 80,000 troops, which would be a reduction of about 60,000, you would essentially mean the United States would have no participation in any type of operation inside of Iraq, which I would argue, and others do argue, would cause fairly quickly the collapse of absolutely everything in Iraq, including the Iraqi army, including the Iraqi government. There is also, I think, a growing realization, and again, it's going to be an issue on which there's a great deal of dispute, that the discussion which former Secretary of State Baker, in fact, led may not go anywhere, which is the discussion of, quote, overtures to Iran into Iraq. It sounds really nice in theory. When you get down to the brass tacks of it, you think about how this happens, what it means. You start to have a great deal of indigestion. And I can say this on a personal note. I think the President of the United States, who ultimately this commission is aimed at to some extent, is highly resistant, if not virulent, on the issue of Iran. And I think will be very, very skeptical about any recommendation that says you can go to Ahmadinejad and Khamenei and somehow they are going to help you out of a very difficult situation in Iraq. I also think that view, if it is actually put forward, is, believe it or not, going to have some resistance in the Department of State. I think the State Department, through the EU3 process, either directly or indirectly with Iran, has gotten somewhat of a nasty taste in its mouth. And I don't expect to see the Americans really believe that any type of initiative to the Iranians will be helpful inside of Iraq and be helpful in general. And certainly with the Iranian pedal to the floor on the nuclear program, it is not something that if the Iranians really wanted the Americans to look at them as being a partner in Iraq, it's not something that you would want to encourage and certainly accelerate. And by all accounts, the Iranians are moving forward on their nuclear weapons program as fast as they possibly can. And I will just add that as things collapse in Iraq, and they are collapsing, and unless the United States military changes its tactics significantly and becomes much more aggressive, and that seems unlikely now, I think you're going to see the situation get a lot worse very quickly. This is also, on the vis-a-vis Iran and Syria, going to make it even harder for the United States to actually deal with these people. There is no doubt about it, the Iranians have been up to mischief in Iraq, so have the Syrians. The continuing deterioration inside of Iraq is not likely to make the Americans more susceptible to negotiations with the Iranians or the Syrians. It's likely to make them less susceptible. And I think that is an understanding which is growing in Washington. It hasn't penetrated all regions of the Baker Commission, but I suspect it's penetrated enough that it's going to cause a recommendation which really isn't going to fly and is going to have so many qualifications it's not going to have much resonance. And the same thing is true for Syria. Iraq is actually, because of the difficulties in Iraq, because of the probability it's going to get a lot worse, not better, it's actually going to make the chances of a rapprochement or a revision in the way you see the Assad regime in Syria, I think, less likely. I wouldn't be surprised if you will see some movement inside the Department of State to sort of differentiate with Syria and try to wean Syria away from Iran. But really, I'm very highly skeptical that's going to go anywhere. There is a general understanding that Syria is still up to no good in Lebanon and will do all that it can, and is doing all that it can to actually recapture lost ground inside of Lebanon. So all in all, I don't see much change in the way the United States is going to conduct itself vis-a-vis Syria or Iran, and that Iraq is actually going to make this more difficult for those who are in favor of trying to work with the Iranians and Syrians. It's not going to make it less difficult.